Hi there. I'm here today with my female western hognose snake, dark side, and my blue-eyed leucistic, well actually just one of my blue-eyed leucistic ball pythons. His name is Sinatra. What I'm here today to talk to you about is something a little bit different than hognose snakes or ball pythons. What I want to talk to you about is captive bred, captive hatched, and wild caught reptiles and amphibians and whatever kind of creature you might be interested in buying. And I want to talk to you a little bit about the pros and cons of each of these and just basically what they are, because these are terms that you're going to see thrown around a lot, but what do they actually mean? And so I want to start off right there. I want to explain what the difference is between being captive bred and captive hatched or wild caught. So captive bred, sometimes you'll see this abbreviated as CBB. Captive bred individuals are individuals that not only were either hatched or born in captivity, but their parents were captive individuals at the time that they were conceived. Captive hatched is a little bit different. Captive born or captive hatched, that's just CB. Those are still individuals that were either hatched or born in captivity, but they are the offspring of gravid or pregnant females that were caught in the wild and happened to be either gravid or pregnant when they were brought into captivity. And last are wild caught. And wild caught individuals, which sometimes you'll see abbreviated as WC, those are individuals that are caught in the wild, either as juveniles or adults, but when they hatched out of the egg or were born, they were wild individuals. Now I want to talk first about captive bred, CBB individuals. And the reason I want to talk about this first is because captive bred individuals are always going to be the best pets. So if you're looking for a reptile, you'll notice in all of our videos we are recommending captive bred animals. Those are always going to be your best pets. And there are a number of reasons for this. For starters, they come from species, and not only just species, but their actual parents make good captives. So these aren't going to be the types of reptiles that nobody can keep alive. Obviously, people are able to keep them alive, and not only is there species, a species that can be kept alive, but their very parents, the parents of the individuals you are buying, are doing well in captivity, and that's a very good sign. They're also, generally speaking, going to be free from parasites and diseases that a lot of wild-caught snakes or lizards or other reptiles will come into captivity already having inside of their bodies, possibly not showing any symptoms of anything. In fact, sometimes they won't start to show symptoms until the stress of being transported and being moved into captivity suddenly take a toll on them and they crash very quickly, which is something we'll talk about here in a second. Another thing is that captive bred individuals, because captivity and interaction with humans has been part of their life for their entire lives, they're going to be a lot better with handling. That's not to say that every reptile is good for handling, but the captive bred individuals are almost always going to be better than a wild-caught individual to handle. They're also going to be better eaters. And that's sort of a time when it's worth talking about both hognose snakes and ball pythons, because both of these types of snakes are actually notoriously difficult to feed, and they don't really deserve those reputations. Ball pythons that come from the wild tend to be very, very picky eaters because, for one thing, in captivity they're eating a diet they've never eaten before. They may or may not even recognize it as being food. And that gets actually more extreme with hognose snakes, which in the wild generally aren't feeding on rodents very often, and they're going to be feeding on amphibians and lizards and things like this, which are usually not offering them in captivity. So both of these snakes can be very, very difficult as wild-caught individuals to get them feeding, especially hognose snakes. A lot of hognose snakes will never switch over to rodents when they're caught out of the wild. But when you get captive-bred individuals, much of the time they're very, very good eaters, at least way better than wild-caught. That applies to ball pythons and hognose snakes and really almost anything, because they're going to be raised right from the moment of birth or hatching on the foods that you're going to be feeding them, commercially available feeders, and that's really great. They're going to be acclimated to captivity. Something we mentioned before is just the stress of suddenly having their entire lifestyle get flipped on its head can sometimes be really, really hard on an individual. And you know that a captive bred individual is already acclimated to that, and that's a very good thing. Their care needs also will be well known. If people are successfully keeping them and breeding them, people know how to keep them alive and how to help them thrive in captivity. And you will have the advantage of being able to talk to the breeders that you are buying from and ask them, what should I do to set up this animal properly? Whereas when you get a wild-caught individual, some of those are animals that are brought into captivity because nobody can keep them alive, and so the only ones you can buy are ones that are caught out of the wild, and they all die very quickly because nobody has a clue what they actually need, and there's no one you could ask because nobody's doing it right. These are not going to be good pets. A good example of this would be the flying dragons, the Draco lizards. There's just a handful of people who've ever been able to even keep those alive. You can buy them relatively inexpensively, but they're gonna crash and die on you, and there are very few people in the world who would know what to do to change that. I'm not one of those people. I don't even know anybody who knows what to do. Additionally, when you buy a captive bred individual, you're doing no harm to wild populations. Sometimes animals that are captured in the wild are not captured in a sustainable way. They're being over-harvested because there's a demand for them in the pet trade or in other markets. And when this is the case, you could actually be leading to the destruction of the wild populations. They may vanish entirely from the wild if we're not careful and responsible with the way that they're harvested from the wild. And if you're buying a captive bred individual, not a single one is needing to leave the wild so that you can have an awesome pet. And that's a very good thing. So those are a lot of the huge advantages of captive bred. I'm going to tell you every time, buy a captive bred individual. Sometimes that's not an option. And captive hatched may be a decent alternative sometimes. It's certainly better than buying a wild caught individual because it has some of the advantages of a captive bred individual. For one thing, they're not going to have the parasites that are picked up during the lifetime of an animal. They may actually have some diseases or other health issues inherited from their mother, but generally speaking, they're not going to get anything from mom. They're going to be just as healthy as a captive bred individual. They're also going to be better with handling and better feeders because, once again, right from the moment of their birth or hatching, you're going to be able to raise them on the types of feeders that are available to you. And, again, they're going to be acclimated to captivity because it's all they've ever known. But that's not all the advantages of buying a captive bred individual. There are a lot more, right? The worst option, and I'm not going to say there's never a place for this, but the worst option is buying a wild-caught individual. The worst reason to go with the worst option is because they're cheaper. And the truth is they are usually cheaper because it costs a lot less to reach into a hole and pull out a snake than to raise its parents up from babies, feeding them all the while, keeping them alive, putting food into them, and space and housing and all kinds of other resources into getting your breeding population going, then incubating the eggs, getting those out. These things are expensive, right? And when you buy a captive bred individual, you're not just buying the snake, right? You're buying the time and expertise of the breeder, and you're also buying advice from that breeder as to how to take care of it. When you buy a wild caught, the people who wild caught it might not have a clue how you're supposed to keep this alive in captivity. That's not why they're doing this, right? They're just trying to get by, maybe just feed their families, and that's understandable, but so are the breeders. And the breeders are doing it in a far more sustainable way. Support the breeders. Don't go for a cheap wild-caught animal just to save a few bucks. But there are reasons. Now, one of them is that some species have never been bred in captivity. They might be species that actually do fairly well as adults, but we don't know how to convince them to reproduce in captivity just yet. And in that case, you're going to need to buy either a wild-caught or, best case scenario, captive hatched individual. The best reason to buy a wild-caught individual is because you're an experienced keeper and breeder, and you are trying to develop a breeding program so that captive bred individuals will be available in the future. And that's a very good reason to get wild-caught individuals. There, in fact, are no species of reptiles or any other pet animal that exists in captivity that at one point wasn't wild-caught. And so at some point, wild-caught individuals need to come in if they're going to exist at all in the pet trade. And that's a whole other thing to talk about. Another thing just to consider is no matter who you are, even if you're very experienced, the truth is wild-caught individuals just don't do as well. And there's a pretty high mortality rate. So if you're an experienced keeper and breeder, you probably don't need to hear this from me, you already know it. If you're thinking about getting one to save a few bucks, realize not only is that not sustainable and not a good idea for a host of reasons, but on top of that, there's a much higher chance that the individual you buy, even if you get it cheap, won't even survive. And so keep that in mind. You might not really be saving money at all. The way to go is to buy a captive bred individual, and breeders are now all over the place. There are great breeders. There are going to be great breeders near you, online, at reptile expos. There are great places to go. This is a golden age of reptile keeping, and I'm just grateful that I get to be a part of it. I hope this has been helpful for you. I would love, as always, to see your questions, your comments, your experiences, and as always, like and subscribe, and we hope to see you real soon.
So I'm not as good.
Shoot.